We ended 2025 in South Africa's agricultural sector with a view that at Agriview we described it as mixed performance in the South African farming economy. And there were a number of things that made us categorize the year or characterize the year in that way. And one of those was the fact that although we were talking about a recovery, and I think when the data is finally out from Stats SA, it will likely show that this sector grew pretty much robustly, anywhere over 5%, 8% or so in terms of the gross value added expansion in the farming economy of South Africa. But that optimism and that solid growth is really not shared across all of the subsectors. We struggled with the foot and mouth disease in cattle farming. Thankfully, the issues of the cattle farmers did not really spill over to the wool farmers. Because you remember in 2022-23, when we had a foot and mouth disease, we had a situation where some of the important market for our wool industry, China, decided that, hey, South Africa has a foot and mouth disease. Now we are no longer going to be importing wool for a particular period. And they put a temporary ban on the South African wool import. And that was very painful because China accounts for about 70% of the South African wool market. So that was a bit of a challenge for us. But this time around, we do have a protocol. We know how to work with China, and there were no issues there. But if you are a cattle farmer, then this was a difficult period because at the start of 2025, you faced the challenges of higher feed cost. And as the feed costs come down because of the large ample grain harvest, there was also another challenge that you were facing, which is the continuation of a foot and mouth disease where we were just not getting a handle of it. And as we said at the end of 2025 on Agriview, this year is going to be a busy period whereby this vaccination of 12 million head of cattle in South Africa has to accelerate. So all of that work of vaccinating all of these animals will actually go on full force this time around. And if you are interested, by the way, on what exactly did we say and how is this process going to pan out, check on our channel the episode that is related to that, where we go deeper onto that aspect. But I think that was a downside of 2025, is the foot and mouth disease and how much it weighed in the cattle industry, and by virtue just generally the livestock sector or subsector in South Africa. But if you were to take a look now on what happened in field crops, as well as in horticulture, fruit, vegetables, we had one of the excellent performances on that time. I mean, record soybean crop, second largest maize crop, and all of these excellent activities that were happening in the field crop space. And at the core of that, it was the favourable rainfall that we got as South Africa, but also the improvements that were made at the ports, although the ports are not operating efficiently to levels that many people desire. But we were able to push out the exports. I mean, we now still have about data for the 3 quarters of 2025. And if you look at that, and as I said in the previous segments, our exports are at 11.7 billion US dollars, up 10%. So that shows you then the recap of that activity of 2025, that mixed improvement. Now then we are in 2026. So what now? Like, how are we thinking about the season? I think that the two things that were the primary catalysts of agricultural activity in 2025 will continue, but continue on a positive this year. Firstly, we remain in a La Niña period. And I know that during Christmas holiday, a heavy rain inconvenienced many of you when moving from one area to another area. And rains can be disruptive and damaging in property in some of the other areas and households. But I think if we step away from that and you look primarily in agriculture and say, what has happened? I think that these rains have actually been excellent in terms of ensuring that we improve soil moisture. They support crop conditions. Across the country now, the crop conditions are looking reasonably well. And not only just in terms of the field crops, which is grains, oilseeds, and sugarcane, but I think broadly things are looking fairly well. Because remember, in South Africa, we only irrigate about 10% of our field crop, particularly in grains and oilseeds. The rest of it, about 90%, is really rain-fed. So when it's not raining, we struggle. And now we are releasing this episode and recording it in January 2026. We want this rain to continue all the way to the end of February or even in the beginning of March. Remember, last year, the rain continued through to the end of April, and that caused us a bit of some crop quality conditions. But this time around, if it can end around about beginning of March, I think that things will turn out reasonably well for our agricultural sector. And when I look at the La Nina forecast, they still suggest that the La Nina will cool off from March onwards. So I think that we are sitting as South Africa's agricultural sector in pretty much a good year in terms of the support that we are receiving from rainfall. But there's another downside, though, of the excessive rains, and that has a lot to do with animal diseases. Because if you think about Rift Fever Valley and some of the other diseases that we get to experience in small stock, cattle, and even on a horse, they come with these excessive rains, which is why then we continue to be worried about South Africa's effectiveness on manufacturing some of the vaccines, which is why we've consistently made the point that we need to capacitate OBP as well as the ARC, the Agricultural Research Council, so that they continue with the work that they do on producing some of these vaccines. But beyond the state-owned organizations, we have to look at the private sector organizations in South Africa. These are South African companies, and say, can they produce the vaccines that are needed? If they can, then let's allow them to produce the vaccine so that the farmers are able to get all of the medicine that they need. And I think that with these heavy rains, that's something that we will be watching, especially getting into February, to say, are there any animal disease issues? But I'm saying this not to say there must be a panic. I still think that broadly, as a country, this favorable rainfall will help us on this. So in a way, the recap that I just provided you about soybeans having to be a record crop in 2024-25 production season, that's something that may be likely in 2025-26 production season, because we are receiving just as excellent rains. When we look at the area that the farmers have planted, they've actually planted an area that is 1% up from last year, around 4.5 million hectares. So the expansion in planting is something that is important. And of course, in February, we will get the exact estimate of how much area that is planted. Right now in January, we are still going with the intentions to plant data, which is what the farmers had signaled to us. But also just in our observations during the December holiday, driving around South Africa, we actually saw that the field work in the farms was looking pretty much promising. So if we see then that recovery in crop production, and I think that's what we will see also in the fruit. But in the fruit space, we will also likely see that the input costs may not be as difficult as they have been. Because remember, all of our fruit and vegetables are 100% under irrigation. So when it rains, you don't have to irrigate all that much. And that helps you a little bit on the electricity prices and just the energy cost in running your farming enterprises. So those are the positive. But the last big positive is the fact that we have now to continue with the vaccination. And as in the commercial space, whereby, by the way, about 7.2 million cattle are in that commercial space in South Africa, and the rest of it to take us to 12 million is in the former homelands and the townships and the other areas. We are inclined to believe that for 2026, the livestock industry may not experience as much difficult headwinds as what we experience in 2025 as we begin to see the gains of the vaccination. And I think it will contribute to a positive growth. And I would say even in the poultry industry, and I know that the poultry farmers are complaining about imports and all of those aspects, but I think if you look at the input component, because the poultry production cost, about 60 to 70% of them is really soybeans and maize. And now we have soybean and maize as we are in January this year. If you look at those prices, they are still double-digit down compared to where we were a year ago. And that helps a lot. And by the end of 2025 in December, maize and soybean prices were down by roughly 30% from a year ago. So that means then if the farming businesses, they bought some of their feed at that time, the input cost component was not as difficult. And these are all of the factors that I think from a production side, they are pretty much shaping our environment for the positive growth in 2026. And in our previous episode, we talked about the policy reforms that are necessary. And one of those areas that we said must be a clear area of focus is this area about making sure that we expand the export markets, focusing more in Asia and the Middle East, while at the same time making sure that we don't take our foot off the gas in the EU, in the Americas, African continent, and the other areas. So if then the production conditions are looking as this positive, we are inclined to believe that then our exports will pretty much also be fairly robust going forward in 2026. Therefore, the better functioning of the ports, opening up as many export markets as we can, these are all the contributing factors that are necessary really to push the growth this year. But production conditions broadly are looking fairly excellent for this season. If you're watching this for the first time this year, make sure that you check our previous episode where we talked about the policy outlook, because right now we just discussed the production fundamentals, but there is policy and the policy aspects that are there that actually underpin this environment that we are operating in. Check that in our channel. And thank you so very much for watching this episode. And hey, I must say, we are able to deliver all of this content because of the generosity of our friends at Nedbank that who continue to support us throughout all of this work. Thank you so very much, and make sure that you click in the description on the link and subscribe to this channel.